Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight we're coming to you this evening from Budapest, Hungary, right over the Danube River. It's a place we're going to be telling you a lot about in coming days. If you care about Western civilization and democracy and families and the ferocious assault on all three of those things by the leaders of our global institutions, you should know what is happening here right now. But more on that to come, a lot more. First tonight, though, we're continuing to follow the bizarre and very fast-changing guidance on COVID from the White House. Remember when they told you the last administration was incompetent? We've never seen anything like this. It's beyond belief. It was just a week ago that Rochelle Walensky of the CDC did her best to terrify all of us over the new Indian strain of COVID. Walensky described the so-called Delta variant as, quote, one of the most infectious respiratory diseases we know of and that I have seen in my 20-year career. An internal CDC document summed it up in martial terms, quote, the war has changed, wrote the CDC. In response to those horrifying developments, the administration immediately re-implemented indoor mask mandates, even for people who've been fully vaccinated. And that was enough to get even the deeply incurious American news media asking questions. Wait a second. If the vaccines work, why the masks? So they started digging, and they didn't have to dig much. On Friday morning, the Washington Post ran this headline, quote, vaccinated people made up 3/4 of those infected in a massive Massachusetts COVID-19 outbreak. Pivotal CDC study finds, end quote. The New York Times ran a similar piece. Again, it was based on numbers from the CDC. And yet just minutes after those articles appeared, the White House panicked. A senior member of its COVID-19 response team, a man who is not a doctor, but instead a career flack called Ben Wanaka, jumped on social media to attack the media, and in fact attack the administration's own scientists. Here was Wanaka's message to the New York Times on Twitter over the weekend. He wrote it in all caps, as if he was shouting, quote, vaccinated people do not transmit the virus at the same rate as unvaccinated people, and if you fail to include that context, you're doing it wrong, he barked. He went on to call the Washington Post coverage of it irresponsible, and he added this, quote, let's be clear. If 10 vaccinated people walk into a room full of COVID, about 9 of them would walk out of the room with no COVID. 9 of them. But is that true? Ben Wanaka, the one who was not a doctor but instead a flack, did not provide a citation for that statistic. And in fact, judging by the CDC's own numbers, it appears to be wrong. In other words, it is classic misinformation, possibly Russian in origin. And yet, strangely, Ben Wanaka, who knows much less about science than, say, Alex Jones, was not banned from the internet. He just kept tweeting. And then a few hours later, he got backup support from Rochelle Walensky herself. The vaccine works, Walensky shouted. In fact, it works so well, you may soon be forced to get it. So we're looking into a federal vaccine mandate. But then just minutes after she said that, Rochelle Walensky went on Twitter to take it back. Quote, to clarify, there will be no nationwide mandate. I was referring to mandates by private institutions and portions of the federal government, end quote. But of course, that's not at all what she said. She said, we're looking into a federal mandate nationwide. Then on Sunday, the head of the NIH, the highly political Francis Collins, explained that those, quote, mandates by private institutions might look like this.
Do you think, as a public health measure, it would be good for more businesses to require vaccine credentials in order to have vaccinated customers?
As a public health person who wants to see this pandemic end, yes, I think anything we can do to encourage reluctant folks to get vaccinated because they'll want to be part of these public events, that's a good thing. I'm delighted to see employers like Disney and Walmart coming out and asking their staff now to be vaccinated. I'm glad to see the president has said all federal employees, I oversee NIH with 45,000 people, need to also get vaccinated, or if they're not, to get regular testing, which is inconvenient. All of those steps, I think, are in the right direction.
On the other hand, why would you need to be sure if vaccination is a choice? Collins did not explain, by the way, how unvaccinated people could possibly pose a threat to vaccinated people, because remember, the vaccines work so well we have to mandate them for public health reasons. But at the same time, people who have been vaccinated are threatened by those who don't. You following this? Does it make any sense to you at all? Do you need a medical degree to know it's complete nonsense? No, you don't. Here's one thing you should know. These restrictions do not apply to everyone. Prominent Democrats have been exempted from them. Barack Obama, for example, just announced that he is inviting 500 people to his 60th birthday party at his $12 million spread on Martha's Vineyard, the house which, despite climate change, by the way, is right on the ocean. Pearl Jam will perform. Steven Spielberg has been invited. There will be 200 staff. Why 200? Because when you're as oppressed as Michelle Obama is, you really can't have too many servants. And she doesn't. 200 is not too many. So it turns out Martha's Vineyard is exempt from the new COVID rules. Aspen will be too, for sure. Parts of Washington, D.C. have already been given a pass. We know that because Mayor Muriel Bowser delayed the implementation of her mask mandate long enough to celebrate her own birthday party. Dave Chappelle came, dozens of others did too. And then after the mask mandate went into effect on Saturday, Muriel Bowser, who is the mayor and can do whatever she wants, officiated a wedding at a high-priced hotel in a very pale neighborhood, not a diverse place. Now, you'd think all of this, the lack of equity and diversity and the hypocrisy, would bother CNN. They're on the lookout for those things, but they weren't. Muriel Bowser is part of the ruling class, and their job is to defend her no matter what she does. So they did.
But here's the thing, right? She wasn't actually, as far as we know, violating the new rules, correct?
I think that is fair to say. I mean, I look at the photo and I see it. It seems like it could be during the toast, right? Everyone's heads are pointed in a certain direction. It seems like maybe they are listening to someone, is what it appears to me.
Can you imagine? You're a news network and you're taking your airtime to defend the hypocrisy of politicians. Because why? Are they paying you, or you feel a moral duty to do that? You're more loyal to them than you are to your viewers, to the country. So where does this lead? What does civil rights mean when they're not enforced across the board? When your rights are given to you based on who you vote for, they're not really civil rights, are they? They're privileges. And that's exactly what's happening. In fact, it's happening around the world. Rights that we took for granted, that we believed we were born with in the English-speaking world, have disappeared. Australia is a former prison colony. Increasingly, it's looking like it once was. The Australian military is now enforcing martial law. People are not allowed to leave their homes. That's because of a COVID outbreak this summer that led to a grand total, get your pencils, of 9 deaths. 9 people died of the virus, and they're shutting down Australia, and they're using the military to do it. Police helicopters are clearing people off the beach. Is there scientific justification for this? No, but they're doing it anyway. The Anglosphere committing suicide collectively. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, Great Britain. What do they have in common? They speak the same language, they have the same culture, and all of them are allowing COVID to defeat them. In Australia, people not allowed on the beach and not allowed to ask why either. We know that because Sky News Australia, which has the same owners as this channel, has just been banned on YouTube in Australia. Why is that? Well, Sky News Australia reported that outdoor mask mandates and universal lockdowns may not be necessary to defeat COVID or very effective in defeating COVID. They reported that the science is far from settled on those questions, and they're right. It is far from settled. It's obvious to anyone who's watched the Biden administration berate its own scientists on social media this weekend. The science is not settled. Science rarely is settled, in fact. It's a process of seeking the truth. It is not the same as a political directive. Just because the person in power tells you something doesn't mean it's, quote, science. Just because CNN defends that person exempting himself from his own rules does not make that science. But rather than admit this obvious truth, the truth that almost all Americans understand intuitively, the people running our government, including the public health establishment, which they employ, panic. How long until they're kicking us off beaches and locking us in our homes? Will we be allowed to complain about it when they do? Vivek Ramaswamy is the author of Woke Inc. He spent a long career in business and has taken a break from that because he thinks the country's in trouble, not least because of things like this. Vivek, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. So what should we make? What lessons should we draw when politicians exempt themselves from their own rules? When Barack Obama has his guests, 500 guests and 200 servants to his oceanfront home in Martha's Vineyard at a time when the rest of us aren't allowed to do that. What should we learn from that?
We should learn Tucker, that the guiding principle is do as I say, not as I do when it comes to government officials' policy on COVID-19. It's funny, it reminds me a lot of a white-collar criminal in the 1980s, Leona Helmsley, who famously said, "We don't pay taxes, only little people pay taxes." Well, today, only little people are the ones who are expected to abide by these COVID-19 restrictions. It is laughable if the consequences weren't so serious, and the government has given the public absolutely zero reason to trust anything they have to say, Tucker. The government did not trust the public at the start of this pandemic, and now the public doesn't trust the government in return, and that's a problem.
Well, it is a problem, particularly in public health. I mean, you've been in public health. You ran a pharma company, a successful one, developing new drugs, treatments for disease. If the public doesn't believe physicians or public health authorities, like, what kind of country do you have over time?
That's absolutely right. And now we see the censorship to top it off. I'll tell you this, Tucker. I was a Harvard-trained scientist. I started a biotech company. I care about the integrity of science. And science is not what some government official says on a given day, depending on what side of the bed he woke up on. Science is a method. It is a method of pursuing truth that requires free speech, open debate, and skepticism. Yes, skepticism is part of science. And instead, science, we've seen science transformed into becoming this institution. I think of it as a church, what I call the Church of Scientism. And ironically, the Church of Scientism has put science itself on the altar as a sacrificial lamb. What we really need is a revival of the open discourse that allows us to discover what of our ideas will be proven wrong in the future. And without open debate, without open dialogue, we can't do that.
And isn't that why, I mean, you would know since you started a biotech company, but the United States has led the world in scientific innovation for 100 years because it's the most open country.
That's right. I mean, we have to be humble about what we do know and what we don't. History teaches us that most of our beliefs will either be proven false or modified in some way, but the only way we get there is not through censorship, is not through government-coordinated censorship with these so-called private companies, but through open discourse and honesty and humility and skepticism. That is what science depends on. And now, in the name of science, the worst kind of betrayal of science, Tucker, is in the name of science itself, and that's what we're seeing.
That's totally right. Humility is the root of wisdom, and it's the root of science. And thank you for reminding us of that. Vivek Ramaswamy, great to see you tonight.
Thanks, Tucker.
So you often hear people say, yeah, I'm required to wear a mask, but what's the harm? It's a small price to pay. But is it a small price? Is there an effect on people and the society that we live in? Jeffrey Anderson, maybe more than anyone in recent months, has thought deeply about that question. He just Masking of America, which we strongly recommend. We probably should just read it on the air. But instead, we're going to have him join us right now. Jeffrey Anderson was the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics at DOJ, and he joins us. Jeffrey Anderson, thanks so much for coming on. So you hear that all the time. I heard it this afternoon from an old friend of mine. You know, it's a small price to pay. I'm willing to do my part. Why should we pause before we agree to this?
I think it's a huge price to pay, Tucker, for society as a whole. Masks are uncomfortable, they're unhygienic. They profoundly compromise human interaction, human communication, human sociability, and human understanding. There's a reason that we have not concealed the face in the West. It's because we know that each individual human being is a unique individual. And the way we can tell that is largely, the way we identify someone is largely by his or her face. A country that forgets the importance of the face is probably also going to forget the importance of certain unalienable rights. When we walk around looking like faceless stormtroopers, it doesn't exactly inspire a lot of confidence that we're fit to be free, self-governing citizens in a republic.
Such a deep point. I just want to write out what you said and put it on my refrigerator. The importance of the human face reminds us of the importance of the human individual. We're not all the same. That's why we don't wear uniforms. So do you think their insistence that we cover our faces, that everyone look exactly alike, reveals how they feel about us?
I think it certainly suggests that to some degree, and our willingness to go along with it says something about how we view ourselves in relation to them. We've had way too much government by public health official in recent months, or by executives who act like they're kings or emperors, rather than by representative legislatures who are supposed to be the ones representing us on these questions.
So this, I mean, it does seem, and I don't want to overstate anything or make anyone more fearful or more paranoid, but it does seem like democracy, to some extent, our understanding of our relationship to the state is at stake here.
I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting to compare this experience with, say, 1918 and the Spanish flu and some of the other pandemics that have hit and Americans' reaction to that. If we compare COVID to the Spanish flu, an American under 40 years of age had more than 100 times the chance of dying of the Spanish flu than of COVID-19. The Spanish flu was more than 100 times as deadly than COVID for Americans under 40. You certainly don't hear that. There's a culture of fear being inculcated, and we simply, so far we've been going along with it way too much, and I think that we need to actually look at the science, which suggests masks are really not that effective, and look at the full picture, which shows that they're doing a great deal of harm.
I think that's exactly right. Thank you for reminding us of that terrific piece in the Claremont Review of Books. Jeffrey Anderson, appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Meanwhile, as our public health authorities try to terrify us about a resurgence of the Delta variant, people were dying all over the country of the violence that they have allowed. In the city of New Orleans, for example, several people were shot on Bourbon Street, where you've probably been in the French Quarter if you've been a tourist in that city. Now, another major American city is about to set an all-time record for violent crime. We'll tell you where. We're coming to you, as we said, live from Budapest, Hungary. We're on assignment for our documentary series. We'll tell you a lot more coming up. So we're standing in front of the Hungarian Supreme Court building, which is directly across from the Parliament. And like a lot of buildings in this central square in Budapest, on the Pest side of the Danube, there are bullet holes in the marble of the building. And they're all over. Some have been patched, some haven't been. And they're either from the siege of Budapest, which was the end of the Second World War, or they were from the 1956 Hungarian uprising, Soviet bullet holes. And they are a reminder of how many times this country has been dominated by foreign powers. So they're kind of living testament to the violence that has unfolded here, and again, to the foreign domination of this country. And it really affects the way Hungarians feel about themselves and their government. Welcome back from Budapest, Hungary. Well, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last Memorial Day has, inadvertently perhaps, led to the deaths of many thousands more American citizens. Violent crime continues to surge in American cities across the country, thanks to policies put in place since then. Just over the past weekend, there were several shootings in the city of New Orleans. 5 people were shot in the city's French Quarter early Sunday. You can see the crowd fleeing gunfire on your screen. Keep in mind, that's Bourbon Street in the French Quarter of New Orleans. That's where people go when they visit the city. Now, it's too dangerous for people to go a lot of the time. In New York City, the biggest in the country, 10 people were shot, 3 were killed following a gang shootout in front of a laundromat. Bill de Blasio was busy playing volleyball over the weekend, but at least mayoral nominee Eric Adams had something to say about that. Watch.
We are losing the grip on public safety, and we have to respond immediately and treat this like the crisis that it is.
Brooklyn Borough President and Democratic mayoral candidate Eric Adams in North Corona, Queens, condemning the suspected gang-related mass shooting on 37th Avenue that left 10 injured there Saturday night. Adams' comments coming just as another suspected gang member was arraigned for shooting an NYPD officer struggling to disarm him in the Bronx just after midnight Saturday.
Tragedy, every one of them. Heather McDonald is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She joins us now. Heather, thanks so much for coming on. It's infuriating and grief-making to watch those videos because you know they didn't have to happen, those shootings. They did happen because of bad policies. And the people who made those policies will never be held to account for them and never be forced to apologize. You've covered this from a social science point of view for decades. It must enrage you to watch it.
It certainly does, Tucker. We're all living through a real-time experiment testing the left's theories about crime and human nature. According to much of the media, the Democratic elite establishment, crime is just a racist fiction, and the criminal justice system has been designed to oppress blacks. Therefore, we can dismantle law enforcement without negative effects, and will liberate blacks from racist oppression. Well, the results of this experiment have been in for a year, as you say, since the George Floyd riots. And what we've seen is the largest increase in homicide in this nation's history. Dozens of black children mowed down fatally by drive-by shootings, and senior citizens thrashed, beaten mercilessly by racist, hate-filled thugs. This crime wave is coming to a neighborhood near you via carjackings, flash mobs and street robberies. And if we don't completely rebut, without apology, the false narrative that policing is racist, civilization is going to continue to unwind right before our eyes.
I'm not sure most Americans understand that not all cities are like that. I'm standing in a city of 1.7 million people where nothing like that ever happens in Budapest, Hungary. Probably a lot of problems with Budapest, but there's nothing like that. Do Americans, have they come to believe that we have to live like this, that it's like mandatory for some reason?
Well, we've reverted to that, absolutely. In the early 1990s, criminologists were saying for New York City that it was inevitably violent, that is simply the American character. That was the norm, and Rudolph Giuliani and Police Commissioner William Bratton disproved it through effective law enforcement. The root cause of American crime, Tucker, you mentioned Hungarian families, is the breakdown of the family in the inner city. As long as that continues and young boys are raised without any sense of impulse control, deferred gratification, the police are the only thing that stands between the law-abiding residents of poor neighborhoods and utter complete annihilation. So this narrative, far from helping blacks, is hurting them. And the solution to it ultimately is not law enforcement. It's social cohesion and a return to the understanding that children need mothers and fathers.
Yeah. One of the things I love about talking to you is you actually care about what happens to the people we see on our screen being murdered on the sidewalk. No one in charge seems to care. So bless you for that. Heather McDonald, thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
So the southern border is completely open, transforming the country. The Biden administration has allowed many thousands, very soon it'll be millions, of foreign nationals from other nations to enter our country. Now there's an effort underway to make sure all of them can vote. Oh, but don't say it out loud. That's a conspiracy theory. Right. We've got details for you coming up, live from Budapest. So the Biden administration started doing all kinds of things almost immediately after Joe Biden was inaugurated in January. But the very first thing they did, the first big policy change they made, and the one they've stuck to most assiduously, has been to open our southern border, not simply to Latin America, but to the world. Now, why did they do that? Why is that the one thing they did immediately and have kept doing? Well, of course, because they want to change who lives in this country. And they're doing that to undermine democracy itself. When you change who votes, you change the outcome of elections. And they believe by opening the border, they can ensure permanent control of our political system by the Democratic Party for generations. That's not a conspiracy theory. They say it out loud all the time and attack you if you note it. Dick Durbin, who's a senator purportedly from Illinois, just said it out loud on the floor of the Senate a few days ago. Last week, the New York Times published an op-ed, and we're giving the title here directly, quote, "There is no good reason you should have to be a citizen to vote." In other words, the millions coming in should be able to choose your government. The author of that piece argues that actually non-citizens contribute just as much to this country as people who are born here, and they should be allowed to pick your government. That doesn't scare you, nothing will. Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He joins us tonight. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. So they scream at you if you repeat their own words back to them, but I think it's pretty clear, they're not even hiding it, that the whole point of their immigration policy is to ensure political control, replace the population, get a different outcome. Am I misreading this?
No, you're not, and I think it was really important you stressed the urgencies, just as we're seeing the efforts to destroy the Electoral College or pack the court or have a national voter law. They feel that the constituency of the present demography is not on their side, so they can't wait to legally have residents come with green cards and go through a lengthy process of citizenship because they don't think they're going to be in power or they won't have this moment. So they want to have residents immediately become equal to citizens, and they forget that they know that citizenship is the foundation of Western civilization, Tucker. We had a long period of settled civilization, but it was only 2,700 years ago when in the classical world people said, wait a minute, we are permanent fixed peoples. We have identifiable borders. We can make our own laws and elect our own officials and take governance in our own hands. We can't do that if we're migratory tribes, or we don't have a settled space, or we don't have shared and collective customs and traditions that develop from settlement. So when we look at people crossing the border, 2 million of them are scheduled in the next 12 months. We don't know who these people are, Tucker. We don't know if they speak their language, and we don't know if they share our values, that we don't even know if they've ever voted before. And the idea that the moment they come across, and that's the first decision they made was to break U.S. law, the second will be to reside here illegally, they would be co-equal to a citizen, defies the whole concept of civilization. And remember, citizenship's already eroded. It started out, it's mentioned several times in the Constitution as an assumption. You don't even have to define it. But it used to be the idea that a citizen could only hold elected office, could only vote, could only go in and out of the country at his own permission and will, and could serve in the military and was subject to the laws of the United States. And now we see those are mostly eroded, and we're down to just the only thing that separates a citizen from somebody crossing the border on day one was that they could not hold office and they could not vote. And yet already people in some jurisdictions, school board elections in California are voting, and there's talk about even people holding office. When that happens, then we're no different than Rome, with people just in the late 5th century AD coming across the Roman borders, Huns, Vandals, Goths, with no difference in their status, and Roman citizens, and you know what happened after that.
Yeah, and this is being done intentionally, stealing our country from American citizens. It's exactly what this is, and we're allowing it. Victor Davis Hanson, I appreciate your coming on tonight.
Thank you.
So Joe Biden's only been in office for a little over 6 months. He's already radically changed this country in a lot of different ways. He's accused a huge part of the population of being white supremacists, criminals, enemies of the state. And with very few exceptions, Republicans have not even mentioned it, not said a word, and of course done nothing to protect their own voters. Why is that? We talked to one journalist, a man who long considered himself a member of the hard left, why this is, and his answer: bracing. It's coming to you in just a moment. We'll be back from Budapest, Hungary. So we're in the central square in Budapest. This is really the scene of all modern Hungarian history. At various points, there have been executions in this square, revolutions fomented in this square. Right now, this is the seat of the legislative branch. Now, there are 3 main buildings in this square, and they were the product of a competition in the 19th century. The Hungarian people were asked, what kind of parliament building do you want? And so there were 3 entries in that competition, and they built all 3, first, second, and third. The winner is now the Hungarian parliament, right behind me. Neo-Gothic, as you can see. The second is the Supreme Court, which is, as you notice, neoclassical. And that's the third place, right there. We're not even going to name the architectural style. But I think they got it right, first, second, and third.